In the late 1800s, a chilling tale unfurled in the heart of Oklahoma, where two sisters captivated men with charm and hospitality. Yet beneath their allure lay a sinister truth. These women married men only to ensure they would never leave alive. The year was 1889, a time when the American frontier was vast and wild, filled with opportunities, danger, and secrets. The sisters, Eleanor and Margaret, ran a small boarding house on the outskirts of a bustling mining town, a place where weary travelers sought refuge. Their establishment was known for its hospitality, warm meals, and the inviting scent of baked bread wafting from the kitchen. But what no one realized was that those who settled in for the night rarely checked out. Eleanor, the elder, was the more extroverted sister. Her golden hair gleamed in the sunlight, and she possessed a gentle laugh that could put any stranger at ease. Margaret, on the other hand, was quieter, her piercing gaze hidden beneath dark curls. Together they created a perfect facade, fooling their guests into believing they were merely two hard-working women looking to carve out a life for themselves in an unforgiving land. As the sisters welcomed guests each week, they carefully selected men who seemed to possess wealth or promise. Often these men were traveling alone, making them easy targets. Conversations flowed over dinner, filled with the allure of adventure and dreams. But deep down, beneath the sweet smiles and the enticing aroma of their cooking, Eleanor and Margaret harbored dark intentions. Rumors of the sisters' unusual practices began to spread in whispers. Men who had stayed at the boarding house would sometimes disappear, and when inquiries arose, the sisters always had an answer. "He moved on to the next town," they would say with a smile. "He was just passing through." But the truth lay buried deep beneath the floors of their home. One evening, a young prospector named Thomas arrived at the boarding house. He was charming and full of excitement, detailing his ambitions of striking it rich in the nearby mines. The sisters were intrigued. They flattered him, engaged him, and soon Thomas felt he had found the company he had long been seeking. Days turned into weeks as Thomas grew comfortable in his new home. He began to share more than just dreams. He revealed his plans of marrying and settling down once he found his fortune. This was music to Eleanor and Margaret's ears. They saw him not as a potential husband, but as prey. Late one stormy night, when the thunder rumbled outside, Eleanor invited Thomas to share a private dinner, a little too intimate for the usual settings. The candles flickered, casting shadows on the walls, while the sisters exchanged glances filled with unspoken understanding. During the meal, Thomas spoke of his future, of dreams and travel, but Eleanor noticed the growing unease on Margaret's face. It was a simple warning. Tonight was the night. As Thomas laughed and drank deeply, the sisters exchanged a subtle signal. Eleanor poured him another glass of wine, a toast to the future. Deep down, Thomas felt a slight twinge of apprehension, but his excitement drowned it out. What could go wrong, he thought. No one ever truly discovered what happened that night behind the doors of the boarding house. Thomas never left. When word spread of his disappearance, townsfolk raised their eyebrows but didn't dare to confront the sisters. After all, the community had benefited from their presence. They were beloved for their generosity, and it seemed almost impossible that the charming sisters could be hiding something so sinister. But Thomas wasn't the only man who vanished. One by one, whispers of missing men began to grow like weeds. Each disappearance was met with silence and denial, as the sisters wove tales that left many scratching their heads. Months passed, and yet Eleanor and Margaret continued their deadly dance. They set their sights on another traveler, a wealthy landowner named James. This man wore fine clothes and carried himself with confidence. The perfect mark. James was thrilled by the prospect of a warm bed and a hearty meal after a long journey. He had business to discuss, plans to make. His life was full of promise. The sisters welcomed James with open arms. "Stay as long as you'd like," they cooed, their smiles never fading. His bags were heavy with promises of wealth, and they hungered for more. Little did he know, he was entangled in their web. As days turned into weeks, James began to feel at home, but unease began to seep in. Why did he never see any other guests leaving? The answer lingered in the shadows, obscured by the sisters' charming demeanor. Eleanor and Margaret reveled in the act, taking their time, dragging things out. With each day that passed, they further entrenched James into their scheme. Unbeknownst to him, Eleanor had other plans. While Margaret remained silent, the elder sister spun stories, weaving an intricate tapestry of false love and commitment. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie light over the boarding house, James sat with Eleanor in the parlor. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "One day we'll marry," Eleanor whispered, her eyes glinting with a dangerous promise. In that moment, James felt a creeping fear. He meant to leave, to go back to his business, but a sick feeling twisted in his gut. Yet he smiled as if the thought hadn't crossed his mind. "Stay," Eleanor insisted, her voice as smooth as silk. "You have everything you need here." The words hung in the air like a spell, binding him to the sisters. Days later, during a particularly thunderous storm, James made his move. He planned to slip away quietly under the cover of the rain, believing he was clever enough to escape. But the sisters were always one step ahead, having anticipated his unease long before he knew what was going on. Just as he made his way to the door, Eleanor stepped in front of him, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice low and inviting, but with an edge that gave him pause. Suddenly the walls felt close, almost claustrophobic. I was just going for a walk," James lied, sweat beading on his brow. "Why don't you stay for one more night?" Eleanor pressed, stepping closer. Panic surged through him, but the seductive warmth of her voice tied him in place. And so, he stayed. The next morning dawned, bright and sunny, but darker intentions brewed within the sisters' minds. As he sipped his coffee, trying to shake the fog of confusion, James caught sight of something ominous glimmering behind Eleanor's smile. But dread took its time, and before he knew it, it would be too late. For the sisters, the thrill of the hunt was exhilarating, each successful scheme feeding their appetite for control and power. They reveled in their victims' dreams, enveloping them in promises that never materialized. Months passed, but James and Thomas would not be the last. The sisters' story would weave in and out of the small town, gradually buried under the weight of suspicion and quiet screams. Friends and relatives of the missing men began searching. Each inquiry met with false reassurances from Eleanor and Margaret, whose hands, once gentle, grew calloused with blood. Until one fateful day, when fate decided to intervene. A group of men, suspicious and armed, decided to confront the sisters, determined to unveil the truth behind the mystery of the boarding house. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, the sisters braced themselves for the reckoning. The winds howled while secrets danced in the dark, the truth waiting at the doorstep of the macabre story of the sisters who married men they refused to let leave alive. The chilling conclusion awaited in the shadows, a reflection of both horror and humanity, echoing through the haunting walls of their sinister home. As whispers turned into shouts and the air thickened with tension, it became clear. The girls were not just haunted by what they had done. They were ensnared in a tale that refused to end. In the heart of Oklahoma, two sisters had unlocked the door to unspeakable secrets, and with it, a legacy of horror would linger long after the storm had passed. As the men approached the boarding house, the atmosphere grew thick with ominous tension. Eleanor and Margaret exchanged glances, communicating silently. They had prepared for this moment, fully aware that their charming facades might soon be challenged. With quick, calculated movements, they began to clean up the remnants of their past while concocting an innocent story. Eleanor stepped forward, her smile never wavering. "Gentlemen, what brings you to our humble abode on such a stormy day?" The leader of the group, a burly man named Samuel, shifted uneasily but held his ground. "We're looking for answers," he said, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Men from this town have gone missing. We believe they stayed here." At the mention of the missing men, Margaret's expression momentarily faltered, but Eleanor quickly jumped in. Oh, those poor souls. They were just passing through, I assure you. We always let our guests go on their way. Isn't that right, sister? Yes, absolutely, Margaret echoed, her voice a touch too high, betraying her anxiety. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he assessed the sisters. We have reason to believe they might not have left willingly. Some say they were last seen here with you. Eleanor's heart raced, but she masked her fear with a facade of concern. We would never harm anyone. Our guests are treated like family. Surely you must understand. The other men shifted slightly, whispering among themselves. Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. You expect us to believe that? Too many coincidences surround this place. We've heard the stories. Panic rippled through Eleanor's mind as she fought to maintain her composure. What stories? About strange things happening, sudden disappearances, men arriving with hopes, never to leave. Samuel crossed his arms, a steely resolve forming in his gaze. Margaret's pulse quickened. She instinctively concentrated on her sister. They had to divert the attention. Maybe we should invite you in for a warm meal, Margaret suggested, feigning warmth but her eyes darting nervously. You must have stories of your own to share. The men exchanged glances. Samuel seemed intrigued. Fine, but we'll need to ask you a few questions afterward. Just a quick chat. As they settled at the table, Eleanor and Margaret brought out platters of food, their hands steady despite the growing dread within. They served the men with false hospitality, maintaining smiles as they engaged in small talk. But beneath the surface, their minds raced to craft an escape plan, a way to manipulate the situation in their favor. Tell us about your travels, Eleanor prompted, narrowing her focus on Samuel. There's so much excitement around these parts, don't you think? As the men spoke about their journeys, Eleanor and Margaret listened intently, all while scheming. They were determined to control the narrative, to ensure no one would suspect the truth. Every word was a stitch in their intricate web of lies. Samuel continued recounting tales of the frontier, his voice rising with enthusiasm. But Margaret was constantly scanning the room, searching for anything suspicious. She noticed one of the men, named Henry, who appeared particularly uneasy, glancing around as if preparing for a choice he hoped to avoid. Do you believe in the stories of those who've gone missing? Henry suddenly asked, his voice trembling. What stories? Margaret asked too quickly, a hint of irritation creeping into her tone. About the sisters who lure men in and never let them go, he replied, a deep frown creasing his brow. Eleanor's facade cracked briefly. Those are just tales to scare children, she laughed, forcing a lightness into her voice. Surely you don't believe in such nonsense. But Samuel wasn't buying it. No, we believe there's truth beneath those tales. And we intend to find out what really goes on here. The atmosphere thickened with tension. The sisters, realizing the gravity of their predicament, exchanged a quick look. They needed a diversion, a way out before suspicions turned into accusations. The storm outside intensified, raining down violently upon the roof. In a moment of inspiration, Eleanor grabbed a nearby lantern and spoke with fake enthusiasm. Let me show you something extraordinary. Extraordinary? Samuel asked, skepticism thick in his voice. Yes, our cellar has treasures of the old days. The sisters quickly moved to the cellar door, hoping to lead the men away from their current conversation. Intrigued yet cautious, the men followed them to the darkened cellar, its scent musty and thick. It's quite the history down here, Eleanor said, flicking the lantern's flame to illuminate the dusty space. As they wandered deeper, Margaret quietly scanned for an exit, her heart racing. Every instinct told her to run, but she stood steady. Samuel and Henry inspected the shelves filled with old tools, while their companions seemed rooted in raw curiosity. Look, this old mining gear, Henry exclaimed, tugging at a rusty pickaxe that hung from the wall. But just as the sisters thought they might divert attention long enough to escape, Samuel turned sharply, a sudden realization dawning in his eyes. What's that noise? The sound of muffled whispers and heavy breathing began to echo from a small corner of the cellar, catching everyone's attention. What have you got down here? Henry pressed, narrowing his eyes as he darted toward the source of the noise. Nothing. Just some old things, Eleanor exclaimed, her mind racing as her heart pounded in her chest. Samuel stepped forward, his silhouette dark against the flickering lantern light. His instincts kicked in, and with a swift movement he moved toward the hidden space. The sisters pooled their thoughts, ready to maintain their cover. Henry sniffed the air, aware of something amiss. "You're hiding something," he accused, his tone lower now, dangerous. Seconds felt like hours as the sisters realized they might be exposed. They had to think fast. "No, please!" Margaret cried, her voice cracking with feigned desperation. "It's just some old tools." Samuel wasn't convinced. His brows furrowed in suspicion. "We're not leaving until you show us what's hidden here." As Samuel and Henry moved closer, the sisters saw their world unraveling before their eyes. The secret of the missing men was about to be exposed. Feeling cornered, Margaret steeled herself. "Fine! You want to see?" She turned with intent, drawing them in. "Come this way." As they edged closer to the corner, the tension hung thick in the air. Suddenly, from the darkness emerged a figure. They hadn't counted on it. It was another missing traveler, a gaunt and disheveled man, eyes wild with fear. "Help me!" he cried, lurching toward the group, his voice choked with desperation. The sisters froze. Samuel and Henry stood aghast, disbelief etched on their faces. The man fell to his knees, shaking. "They kept me here! You need to get out!" In that moment, chaos ensued. The sisters' carefully constructed world was shattered as Samuel and Henry lunged forward, grabbing the man as he slid across the cold floor. "What is going on here?" Samuel bellowed, his voice thick with anger. Eleanor and Margaret exchanged horrified glances, their desperate game now fully in the open. The truth they had fought so hard to conceal was about to be unmasked, and the weight of their actions loomed large in the shadowy depths of the cellar. As the storm raged outside, echoing their turmoil, the sisters knew they were trapped in a web of their own making. The question remained, how far would they go to maintain control over their dark secrets? Panic surged through the sisters as they faced the reality of their crumbling facade. The desperate man crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, and the shock reverberated around the cellar. Samuel and Henry exchanged incredulous looks, their skepticism giving way to alarm. "Who are you?" Samuel demanded, moving closer to the crouched man. "What do you mean they kept you here? What's going on?" The man looked up, his face pale and drawn, eyes wild with fear. "I'm Frederick. I came here looking for work. But they didn't let me leave. You have to believe me. They'll do the same to you if you stay." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she exchanged a haunted glance with Margaret. This was the moment they had dreaded, the moment their secret would spill into the light. "Enough of this!" Margaret's voice, though shaky, tried to retain a shred of authority. "You're just a crazy drifter. What do you know about us?" Frederick's expression hardened. "They lure you in with hospitality, and then you're trapped. You won't understand until it's too late." His body shook as he spoke, the reality of his words sinking in like a stone. Samuel and Henry exchanged looks, skepticism giving way to concern. "What did they do to you?" Samuel pressed, glancing at the sisters, suspicious of their dark demeanor. Frederick attempted to rise but stumbled, the weight of his dire situation weighing heavily on him. "They drugged me. I woke up chained in the back room. I heard screams, and I remembered the names of the other men who had been here. They took them away. None of them came back." The sisters flinched, the breadth of their secrets hovering in the air like a thick fog. "Let's check the back room," Henry urged, taking a step forward, his instincts heightened. "If he's telling the truth, if they've kept other men here—" "No, wait!" Eleanor interjected, stepping in front of them. Panic-stricken, she formed a desperate plan. "What if you're wrong? What if he has it all wrong? I assure you, you're safe with us." "Safe?" Samuel shouted, incredulity written on his face. "Can you really expect us to believe that after everything we've heard?" Margaret clenched her fists, the tension building as she tried to reel in the chaos. "You should leave now. You don't want to know what happens to those who dig too deep." she warned, her voice low and fervent. "I promise you, life is so much easier if you just walk away." Too late for that," Frederick shouted, gathering his strength. "Let me show you what's really happening here." Unable to contain their growing apprehension, Samuel and Henry rushed forward, their irritation morphing into fury as they cornered the sisters against the cellar wall. "Hiding something, aren't you?" Samuel growled, inches from their faces. "Where's the truth?" Eleanor suddenly launched into action, attempting to manipulate the chaos. "You don't want to know the truth. This is all just a misunderstanding. We're harmless." Frederick watched as Eleanor's bravado crumbled. "You think you can keep lying?" he asked incredulously. "I've seen what you do. You have to stop." In that instant, Eleanor realized the situation had spiraled beyond her control. The house of cards she built was about to collapse, and they were staring down the barrel of exposure. Just as the tension reached its peak, there was a loud crash from outside, causing everyone to freeze momentarily. A bolt of lightning illuminated the room, casting twisted shadows across their faces, as the air grew heavy with anticipation. "What was that?" Henry asked, craning his neck toward the door, his instincts now heightened. "Just the storm," Margaret replied, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "The wind can be like that. Let's focus on our discussion." "Enough with your games. We need to see what's in the back," Samuel insisted, clearly losing patience. With newfound resolve, he turned to Frederick. "Show us where they kept you. Right now." Frederick hesitated, glancing at the sisters before nodding reluctantly. "Follow me." The urgency in his voice hung in the air, pushing him toward the back of the cellar. Eleanor and Margaret weighed their options. They could either assist Frederick and potentially expose their sins or fight, something they knew they couldn't win. "Just stay calm," Margaret hissed to Eleanor. "We can turn this to our advantage." As they moved to the back, the sisters felt time stretch with every creak of the old floorboards. Eleanor struggled to suppress the adrenaline coursing through her veins, echoing the battle brewing between desperation and survival. In a dimly lit corner, Frederick stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. "They kept it locked. It's in here." The sisters felt a wave of dread wash over them. If the truth lay behind that door, it could shatter their careful deception. Samuel, his curiosity piqued, pushed the door open with apprehension. The room was grim and dusty, filled with abandoned relics cloaked in shadows. An old cot sat in the far corner, a single chain attached to its frame lingering evidence of past horrors. They all stepped inside, and as the door creaked open wider, the atmosphere thickened with tension. "What is this place?" Henry demanded, his voice growing desperate. "What have you done?" Frederick's face twisted in anguish. "This was my prison. I knew others were here. I could hear them." The sisters stood frozen, their secret unraveling before their eyes. Their sanctuary had transformed into a den of horrors. Just then, a flicker of movement caught Eleanor's eye in the corner of the room. A canvas wrapped tightly, bulging as if it held something within. Heart-pounding, she took a step closer, driven by an ominous pull. "No, don't touch that!" Margaret shouted too late. Eleanor pulled the cloth back, revealing a collection of personal belongings, items that had belonged to their victims: watches, letters, and trinkets. Each possession told a story, the lives snuffed out by the sisters intertwined with fate and horror. Gasps filled the room as everyone blinked in disbelief. The evidence of their heinous acts was laid bare, stark against the darkness surrounding them. "Now, do you believe us?" Frederick implored, his voice hoarse with fear. Samuel's expression shifted, horror creeping into his gaze. "You monsters!" They were cornered, the walls closing in around them like a vice. Panic rose within Eleanor and Margaret. They had to act, and quickly. Desperation turning into a primal instinct, Eleanor bolted toward the exit, heart racing and chaos unfolding behind her. "We have to get out!" she shouted, grabbing Margaret's arm. "After them!" Samuel yelled to his companions, but the sisters were already slipping through the door, their minds racing with the reality that they could lose everything. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within the sisters' hearts. As they dashed from the cellar, they could hear the men behind them, furious and determined. They had to escape, to maintain their hold on the world they had carved out through lies and deceit. Outside, the wind lashed at their faces, and rain poured down as they sprinted toward the tree line, seeking refuge in the shadows. But escaping the truth was impossible, not when it loomed just behind them. The choice was made, fight or flight, and with every step into darkness, they knew they were on a dangerous path, one that spiraled deeper into the macabre legacy they had created. The sisters continued running, never looking back, until they became nothing more than whispers swirling in the storm. As Eleanor and Margaret dashed into the dense canopy of trees, the thunderous storm wrapped around them like a shroud. The rain fell heavily, soaking their clothes and blurring their vision, but they didn't dare pause. The sisters had lived their lives in shadows, but now they felt like desperate prey, hunted and exposed. Behind them, the echo of angry voices faded slowly, but the sound of heavy footsteps splashed through the mud, urging them to move faster. The sisters weaved through the underbrush, branches scraping against their skin as they fled into the heart of the forest, the darkness swallowing them whole. "Where do we go?" Margaret panted, her breath hitching as they stumbled over roots and rocks. "We can't go back," Eleanor's mind raced. "We need to find shelter, somewhere they can't follow. They won't know the woods like we do." Her heart raced, not just from running, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. They had built a life on deceit, but this was something new, the instinctual drive to survive. They plunged deeper into the forest, where the trees stood thickly, forming a natural barrier against the outside world. The torrential rain masked their footsteps, and for a moment they felt a flicker of hope. But as they pressed onward, the reality of their situation began to settle heavily on their minds. Frederick's words, "They'll never believe us now," Margaret said, her voice shaky. "It's over for us." "Not yet," Eleanor replied, stubbornly clinging to the flicker of defiance ignited within her. "We'll come up with a plan. We always do." The sisters paused when they spotted a dilapidated cabin up ahead, half hidden by the overgrowth. It looked abandoned but offered a glimmer of safety, a temporary refuge from the storm and the men chasing them. "Over there!" Eleanor pointed, leading Margaret toward the structure. They slipped inside, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the rain outside. The interior was musty and dark, filled with remnants of a forgotten life. Old furniture lay in disarray, and dusty cobwebs hung in the corners. "Do you think they'll find us?" Margaret whispered as they sank into a corner, catching their breath. Eleanor's eyes scanned their surroundings. "Not if we keep quiet. We just need to stay low until the storm passes." Shy. Outside, the tempest continued, but inside the cabin, they were cocooned in silence. They listened to the raindrops pelting the roof, the storm a chaotic symphony that matched the tumult in their hearts. But as minutes stretched into hours, the sisters found the quiet unnerving, amplifying the reality of what they had done. Images of the missing men flooded Eleanor's mind. Each moment they had spent weaving their dangerous game, now heavy with regret. "Eleanor, what if this is it? What if we can't go back?" Margaret's voice broke the silence, tinged with fear. Eleanor held her sister's gaze. "We won't go back. We can't. But we have to figure out our next steps. We've survived before. We can do it again." Margaret nodded, but uncertainty lingered in her eyes. The longer they stayed hidden, the more the weight of reality pressed upon them. "What if the men tell everyone? What if they suspect us?" "They will," Eleanor admitted, the truth striking like a jolt. "But we'll have to run. Start fresh. Create new identities. Leave this place behind for good." As they settled deeper into their thoughts, Eleanor's mind drifted to the possessions they had left behind, their carefully crafted lives, their facade of charm and hospitality. Would they ever be able to reclaim those? Or would the specter of their actions follow them, haunting their every step? Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps on the cabin's wooden porch sent her heart racing. "They're here!" Eleanor hissed, the walls closing in around them. Margaret's eyes widened, panic rising. "What do we do?" "We stay calm, If they come in, we'll have to play our cards right, Eleanor whispered frantically, clutching her sister's hand. As the door creaked open, cold wind swept inside, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else. The unmistakable aura of danger. Samuel stepped into the dim light, flanked by Henry and two other men, their faces tense and determined. "Check everywhere," Samuel instructed, his voice low and commanding. "I want to know the truth." The sisters pressed against the wall, breath held, as they watched the men begin to search the cabin. Every creak of wood underfoot caused Eleanor's heart to pound louder, each step echoing the finality of their choices. "Find anything?" Henry called from another corner, clearly annoyed by the search's duration. "No," Samuel replied tersely. "I don't like this. They were last seen heading into the forest. They can't be far." Their voices blended with the roar of the storm outside, tension growing thicker as the sisters remained hidden, adrenaline making their hearts race. A sudden movement caught Eleanor's eye. A dusty old trunk rested against the far wall. An opportunity. "Margaret," she whispered urgently, "we can hide in the trunk. They'll never find us." Margaret hesitated, her breath quickening. "What if they hear us? What if we can't get out?" Eleanor locked eyes with her. "We don't have a choice. We'll stay quiet, and once they leave, we move again." Without waiting for a reply, the sisters edged towards the trunk, moving silently. They slipped inside, the trunk barely large enough to cocoon them both, and pulled the lid shut. They could hear their own heartbeats drumming in the cramped space amidst the rising thunder. The world outside faded as they curled into one another, fear clouding their minds and thoughts racing. Time seemed to stretch as they listened, their breaths shallow. The voices and noises from outside faded into a distant echo. "It's all over," Margaret murmured, the weight of despair creeping into her voice. "We were supposed to be safe here." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand, resolve igniting in her chest. "We're not done yet. We just need to survive the night." Minutes felt like hours, the pounding of the rain masking their racing hearts. But uncertainty lingered, breathless in the air, leaving them with a heavy realization. They had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Why did we let it go this far?" Margaret whispered, fear now entangled with regret. Eleanor's heart ached as she reflected the truth of their situation. "It's too late to turn back now. We have to fight for our lives." Suddenly a loud crash from outside startled them, the heavy door shattering against the wall as the men entered again, voices raised, panic evident. "Where did they go? They couldn't have just vanished," Samuel exclaimed, frustration coloring his tone. "They couldn't have gone far," Henry responded, striding angrily around the room. "We'll find them. We have to." Eleanor held her breath, knowing that any moment could mean disaster. They had walked into darkness, but they weren't finished yet. They would find a way to escape this nightmarish unraveling of their lives. As the storm raged outside, the sisters remained inside the trunk, their lives now hanging in the balance. Would this be the end of their twisted tale? Or could they still claw their way out of darkness? Among the chaos and despair, one thing was clear. They would stop at nothing to survive. Even as shadows loomed large, their past carving deeper shadows into their uncertain future. The night still held secrets, and those secrets were fighting to be revealed. As the chaos outside the trunk continued, Eleanor and Margaret pressed their backs against the cool wood, straining to hear every sound. The footsteps of the men, the creak of the cabin, the ferocious storm raging outside. "We can't stay here forever," Margaret whispered, urgency lacing her voice. Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. "We wait until they leave again. They will think we're gone." Her heart thudded in her chest, a reminder of their fragile hope. Outside, the men were growing increasingly agitated, their voices overlapping in frustrated shouts. "They have to be close. Search every inch of this place," Samuel barked, his patience wearing thin. "Nothing here but old junk," Henry grumbled, clearly fed up with the thorough search. Frederick's voice, though trembling, cut through the fog of fear. "They took me prisoner. You can't let them escape." Eleanor and Margaret exchanged glances, recognizing the danger in Frederick's words, but also the opportunity that lay within them. This was their chance to escape, if only they could wait for the right moment. As more arguments broke out, Eleanor felt the world outside become a tempestuous battlefield, each voice fueled by suspicion and rage. "We double back towards the cabin!" Samuel's voice rose sharply. "They couldn't have gone far." The sisters ventured a glance outside the trunk, hearts pounding. Through a small gap they could see the men tearing through the cabin, their frustration morphing into raw anger. "They're likely hiding in one of the rooms," one of the new men yelled, revealing they had brought reinforcements. Eleanor felt a chill sweep over her. The stakes had escalated dramatically. "They won't stop," she breathed, glancing back at Margaret, whose face was pale with fear. "Should we make a run for it?" she whispered, voice trembling. "We might still have a chance if we can slip out while they're distracted." Eleanor hesitated, weighing their options. If they exposed themselves now, they would be cornered without any means of escape. "No, we wait a little longer." The minutes dragged on, thick with tension and murky uncertainty. The voices rose and fell, echoing in the small cabin, as the men searched with increasing fervor. Eleanor's thoughts raced as she tried to strategize their next step. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, silence fell over the cabin. "They must have gone," Samuel said reluctantly, breaking the stillness. "Split up and search the surrounding area. We'll find them." With that order, the men began to move, their footsteps fading as they ventured into the rain-soaked world outside. Eleanor seized the moment. "Now," she urged softly, grasping Margaret's arm. Slowly, they pushed the trunk open just wide enough to peek out. The cabin was momentarily devoid of men, their absence creating a flicker of freedom beyond the four walls. "Let's go," Eleanor urged, slipping out of the trunk and glancing around the dim cabin. She felt the weight of their desperation as they darted toward the door. Margaret followed close behind, their survival instinct propelling them forward. Together, they crept toward the exit. Outside, the storm raged on, loud and tumultuous, masking their movements as they slipped into the shadows of the trees. "Which way?" Margaret whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. Eleanor pointed toward a thicket where the trees grew thicker. "Over there! We'll find some cover. We have to keep moving." Both sisters sprinted through the undergrowth, urgency driving them deeper into the forest. They had to put distance between themselves and the cabin, the place where their lives had spun out of control. As they moved, the sound of their heavy breathing mingled with the rain, forming a chaotic melody that echoed through the woods. The wet ground squelched beneath their feet, adding to the tension that crackled in the air. Yet, with every step, a sense of fear followed close behind. They knew the pursuing men would not relent. They had tasted the chance to reveal the sisters' secrets. In a moment of clarity, Eleanor stopped, taking a deep breath. "We need to hide until nightfall," she said, scanning their surroundings. There, a gnarled tree with a hollowed-out base seemed to offer a temporary sanctuary. They hurried to the tree, crouching down inside its hollow trunk, just as the first distant shouts reached their ears again. "Do you think they saw us?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "They are close, but they don't know for sure," Eleanor replied, her heart racing. "We'll wait them out here." As the minutes ticked by, silence enveloped them, disrupted only by the sounds of the storm and the distant shouts, occasionally growing louder before fading again. Time blurred, and tension hung thick as they listened for any sign of their pursuers. "How did it come to this?" Margaret finally said, her voice soft. "What if we have to run forever?" Eleanor felt the weight of her sister's words. "We won't. We can find a way. We just need to be smarter." As darkness fell across the forest, it brought a deceptive sense of calm with it as shadows morphed and danced around them. "Maybe we can go back," Margaret suggested, her voice tinged with doubt. "Maybe we can claim ignorance. Tell them we were just scared." Eleanor bit her lip, unwavering in her resolve. "What good would that do? They're already suspicious. They'll never believe us after Frederick." Margaret sighed, leaning her head against the cool bark of the tree. "I just want this to be over." Eleanor nodded, feeling the fear seep into her bones. So do I. But we have to keep moving. We can't let their suspicions bind us. We need to be free. The hours crept on slowly, and as darkness settled in deeper, they listened closely for any signs of movement outside. The rain had begun to ease, falling softly instead of in torrents, creating a quiet lull that cradled their anxious hearts. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Eleanor and Margaret froze as they recognized the echoing voices of their pursuers. They were drawing closer again, exploring the area, their murmurs growing louder. "We know you'll come out," Samuel shouted. "You can't hide forever." Eleanor held her breath, panic clawing at her throat. They would find them. There was no evading the truth. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered frantically, looking into Eleanor's eyes, searching for a spark of hope. Eleanor felt the storm behind her eyes. She refused to be trapped. "We wait it out, and then we escape. They can't hunt us down in the dark." And as the night wore on, the sisters clung to the hope of another dawn. They could feel the tendrils of danger curling around them, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. But they would fight back. They would reclaim their lives, even if it meant plunging deeper into the darkness that surrounded them. As the moon shone high above, casting an ethereal light across the trees, Eleanor and Margaret prepared for the reckoning that awaited them. The desperate pursuit for survival, the truth that lay hidden in the shadows, and the resolve to break free from the macabre tale they had spun together. Their fate was uncertain, but they would not bow down easily. A flight through darkness awaited, and with it, the fierce battle for their lives. As the night draped the forest in shadows, Eleanor and Margaret remained motionless, their hearts pounding in time with the distant footfalls of the men searching for them. The sisters squeezed their eyes shut, fighting the urge to betray their presence with trembles of fear. Outside, Samuel's voice echoed through the damp air. "You can't run from the truth. We will find you." The determination in his tone sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. They had become the hunted, their twisted games spiraling out of control. "Stay quiet," Eleanor whispered fiercely, glancing at Margaret, who seemed to be holding her breath. "We can't let them catch us now." The tension grew thick, and the sounds of the night melded with the rush of adrenaline coursing through their veins. The men were combing through the underbrush, forcing the sisters to remain vigilant and stone still. "Did you hear that?" one of the men called out, his voice heavy with expectation. The crackling of twigs resonated, and a wave of fear washed over the sisters. "Stay low," Margaret urged, pressing her body deeper into the hollow of the ancient tree. They could sense the presence of their pursuers weaving ever closer, the air thick with uncertainty. Hours felt like eternity as the search continued. The men moved closer, their voices rising and falling in the murky shadows surrounding the sisters. "They must be nearby," Samuel called out again. "We'll find them. There's no escape." Eleanor felt the weight of despair settle over her like a lead blanket. "We can't stay here much longer. We have to think of something," she whispered just loud enough for Margaret's ears. Margaret breathed out slowly. "What if they set up a perimeter? We'd be trapped. That's a risk we have to take." "Ye diddy," Eleanor was resolute. "We wait until they regroup, and then we slip away into the darkness." Just then, a new voice entered the fray. A man the sisters didn't recognize. "This isn't going to work. We're wasting time. Let's find the sheriff. He'll know how to deal with this." "Fine," Samuel replied, a hint of frustration coloring his tone. "But we need to return to the cabin first. Let's check again." Eleanor's heart raced. If they returned to the cabin, there would be no escape. Taking a deep breath, she focused on the urgency of their situation. "We'll follow them. The moment they leave the area, we make our move." With every ounce of resolve, the sisters held tightly to each other, minds racing through possible escape routes. They watched through the hollow trunk as the men gathered together, illuminated dimly by the moonlight breaking through the tree canopy. The men began to move away from the tree, heading back toward the cabin, their silhouettes slowly disappearing into the shadows between the trunks. Eleanor felt a surge of energy. Now was their moment. "We go now," she hissed, pulling Margaret out of the hollow. They moved quietly through the underbrush, keeping low and darting behind trees, their hearts beating in a discordant rhythm, filled with both fear and exhilaration. The sisters picked their way cautiously through the forest, well aware of every sound surrounding them. Branches snapped underfoot, twigs cracked, and the rain poured down in waves. As Eleanor and Margaret pushed deeper into the woods, the weight of uncertainty nagged at them. "Which way do we go?" Margaret asked, breathless from the exertion and fear of being found. "We keep following the path toward the river," Eleanor replied, pointing into the darkness. "If we can reach it, we can cross and double back to the other side. They won't expect us there." But as they moved, the sound of stepping in the mud behind them made their stomachs drop. The men had somehow sensed their movement. "They're on the run!" Henry shouted. "After them! They can't get away this time!" Panic ignited in Eleanor's chest. They pushed themselves harder, feet flying over roots and rocks, eyes scanning for obstacles in their path. "Hurry!" Eleanor urged, adrenaline propelling them forward as they raced against time that seemed to spiral faster with each determined step. The darkness grew denser as they sprinted toward the riverbank, the sound of rushing water mingling with the heavy thumping of their hearts. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers fading, and then abruptly growing. The men had split, now spread out searching for them. "They won't stop!" Margaret panted, glancing back in fear, desperation curling her fingers tightly. "They can't! We have to keep going!" Ahead, the faint moonlight illuminated the river, reflecting off the water's surface like shimmering glass. Eleanor could feel the hope beginning to surge within her. "There!" she pointed. "We can cross! We might find shelter on the other side." As they approached the bank, the sound of rushing water grew louder. But so did the voices of their pursuers, the urgency in their shouts rising again. "They're close!" Samuel yelled, desperation echoing in his voice. "Don't let them escape." Eleanor and Margaret shared a frantic glance, realizing their moment was slipping away. "We jump!" Eleanor declared, heart hammering. "We can't let them catch us." They plunged into the water, the cold shock jolting their bodies. The current was strong, pulling at their limbs as they struggled to stay afloat. "Keep moving!" Eleanor called out, battling both the water and her own fears. Margaret fought against the current, every stroke feeling like a battle. "I can't. It's too strong." "Yes, you can," Eleanor urged, reaching out to grasp her sister's hand, pulling her deeper into the river. The sound of their pursuers echoed behind them, the splashing of footsteps scrambling along the bank growing frantic. With a final, desperate push, they swam toward the far bank, limbs heavy and bodies shivering. They could hear the men shouting in frustration as they reached the edge of the river, unable to navigate the raging waters. "Keep going!" Eleanor shouted, adrenaline fueling her as she herded Margaret toward the shore. With one last push, they broke free from the water's grasp and stumbled onto the bank, gasping for breath. They lay on the ground, panting and soaked to the skin, but safe, at least for the moment. Eleanor could feel her heart racing, urgency mixing with a flicker of relief. "We made it," she whispered, eyes wide and searching. But there was no time for celebration. The night was still filled with danger, and their pursuers would not be far behind. "What now?" Margaret gasped, gripping her sister's arm tightly. "Now we move. We have to put more distance between us and the cabin." Eleanor's voice was steady, born from a mixture of fear and determination. Gathering themselves, they rose and pressed into the tree line again, the storm providing the perfect cover. They maneuvered through the thick underbrush, their hearts pounding with each step. As they distanced themselves from the chaos behind them, Eleanor glanced back toward the river, wondering if the men would catch their scent and still follow. They had entered a world of darkness, full of secrets and danger, and only by staying one step ahead could they hope for survival. Beneath the vast expanse of stars, they felt the pulse of the night settling around them. They belonged to the shadows now, two sisters fighting against the tide of fate. As the storm subsided and the world quieted, they knew the real battle had only just begun. The darkness had become their home, a twisted reality where they would either fight for their future or succumb to the sins they had created. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As Eleanor and Margaret pressed deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to close in around them, the moonlight filtering sparingly through the dense canopy above. They moved swiftly, hearts racing. Each rustle of leaves felt amplified in the stillness of the night. "Where do we go now?" Margaret whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, the fear etched on her face. "Do you think they're still following us?" Eleanor considered for a moment, the weight of the last few hours resting heavily on her shoulders. "We need to find higher ground, somewhere to get a view of our surroundings. We can't keep running blindly. We need to be strategic." They crept quietly through the underbrush, carefully making their way up a slope that led toward a ridge. The sounds of the forest enveloped them, the distant howling of wind and the drip of rainwater creating a haunting melody. Finally, they reached a clearing that offered a sweeping view of the landscape below. Eleanor knelt to catch her breath, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. She looked around, scanning the area for any sign of their pursuers. "If we can spot them, we can decide our next move," she said, finally feeling a sense of hope tethered to reality. Margaret joined her, clutching her arm with a mix of fear and determination. "What if they see us, Eleanor? What if they know we're up here?" "We have to take that risk," Eleanor replied, pressing her palms against the damp earth, feeling grounded. "We've made it this far. We can't let fear paralyze us now. We need to be ready for anything." As they peered into the distance, the moon illuminated the area, revealing hints of movement in the darkness. In the far distance, they caught sight of the silhouettes of the men making their way through the trees, their figures bobbing between the trunks like ominous shadows. "It looks like they're heading back to the cabin," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "They're regrouping. What if they realize we're gone? Then we act fast." Eleanor scanned the ridge, plotting their course. "If we angle left, we can loop around them and head toward the outskirts of town." Aye, suddenly there was a loud crack in the distance, followed by a shout, a harsh reality that jolted Eleanor's senses. "They've spotted something," she said urgently. "We have to go, now." At that moment, the serenity of the night shattered, replaced by renewed chaos. The sisters sprang into action, knowing they couldn't waste another second. They slipped back into the cover of the trees, moving with urgency and purpose. Navigating through the forest, they quickly lost their bearings in the chaos of their escape. The rain-soaked ground was treacherous, littered with roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip them at every turn. "We have to keep moving," Eleanor urged, her voice rising above the storm. The sounds of their pursuers faded behind them, but the tension in the air felt thick with fear. As they pressed onward, the sisters stumbled into a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly, creating a hollowed-out area. "Let's hide here for a moment," Eleanor suggested, and they ducked into the small alcove, trying to steady their breathing. Time felt suspended as they listened. The cries of the men grew fainter, yet the fear of discovery lingered in the night air. "What if we never get out of this?" Margaret murmured, her voice shaking as uncertainty washed over her. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness at her sister's words. "We will get out of this. We just need to stay focused." "Together," she insisted, squeezing Margaret's hand tightly. Minutes rolled by like hours, and just as Eleanor began to believe they were safe, a sound echoed through the forest. A soft crunch of leaves, followed by a voice too familiar. "There's no way they got far. They couldn't have crossed the river. Keep looking. They'll show up. We just need to be patient." It was Samuel. Cold dread swept over Eleanor. "They're close. We have to move again," she whispered, pulling Margaret to her feet. She could feel her heart in her throat as they darted into the darkness, slipping deeper into the tangled underbrush. The forest seemed alive with menace, each snap of twigs beneath their feet signaling their urgency. "We can't go back toward the river," Margaret grunted, breathless and panicking slightly. "What if they come our way? Then we'll find another way." "We'll head north," Eleanor decided, determination pushing her forward. She refused to let despair take over. They had come too far to turn back. Navigating through the thick foliage proved increasingly challenging as darkness engulfed the woods. Leaves brushed against their faces, and the underbrush clawed at their legs. but Eleanor kept them focused. They climbed up a steep incline, heartbeats syncing with the sound of their hurried breaths. Somewhere in the distance, raindrops began to ease, and the storm weakened, giving way to an eerie calm. "This way!" Eleanor waved her sister over, leading them away from the steep drop-off that lay at the edge of the foremost cliffs above. The refuge of a nearby thicket promised concealment, and they slipped into it, huddled together as shadows fell over them. They could hear the men growing closer again, voices rising and falling like the sound of distant thunder. "We have to do something," Margaret exclaimed, trembling as she leaned into Eleanor. "We can't just hide here forever." Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't let panic win. "We create a distraction. Just wait while I go back a bit. You stay here, and if they come close, you'll need to run." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "What? No, that's too dangerous. What if they see you?" Eleanor held her gaze, trying to convey a sense of calm. "Listen, I'll make sure they follow me. Just be ready to move." With a final squeeze of Margaret's hand, Eleanor turned on her heel, the weight of the plan heavy in her chest. She crept backward, slipping out of their thicket and moving toward the sounds of their pursuers, her heart pounding with every silent step. Just a few yards away she noticed Samuel and Henry standing together, their expressions tense and frustrated. "They have to be around here somewhere," Samuel growled. "They couldn't have gone far." Eleanor stood behind a tree, holding her breath to remain inconspicuous, her heart racing. She needed to create a diversion. The decision surged within her like electricity, the same instinct that had pushed her through every trial before. Taking a deep breath, she kicked a rock loose from its resting place on the forest floor. It clattered down the cliffside with an echoing thud, a noise that startled the men and drew their attention. "What was that?" Henry asked, frowning, as he spun toward the sound. Eleanor took this moment to dart through the brush, moving quietly but quickly, ensuring that she stayed out of sight. "This way!" she heard Samuel shout. "We'll check it out." Eleanor's heart raced as she slipped deeper into the woods, her sister's safety driving her every step. But as she moved, she felt both exhilaration and terror. Each time she heard the men shouting louder as they approached, the fierce resolve urging her forward. She knew that returning to Margaret was the goal. They needed to stick together. It had always been that way. With every heartbeat, she reinforced her determination. Whatever the outcome, the bond of sisterhood was their most powerful weapon, and she would use it wisely. In that moment, Eleanor realized that no matter where they ended up or how far they had to run, they would find a way to face the darkness awaiting them. Together, they were stronger than the shadows creeping closer. Together, they would emerge from the storm. The shadows swallowed Eleanor as she maneuvered deftly through the underbrush, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the sounds of the rain-soaked forest. With each heartbeat, the stakes felt higher, but the determination to protect her sister fueled her every decision. Ahead, the men were still on alert, scanning the surroundings like predators. Eleanor pressed against a tree trunk, catching her breath as she surveyed their movements. Samuel seemed more agitated, his frustration palpable. "They can't have gone far. They couldn't have crossed without being seen," he insisted, grimacing as he surveyed the tree line. Eleanor couldn't allow them to regroup and solidify their search radius. Taking a deep breath, she decided to use their own fear against them. She picked up another rock and prepared to throw it away from her current hiding spot to create a diversion. Just as she readied her arm, a voice echoed from behind her, a voice that made her blood run cold. "You're not going to get away that easily." Eleanor whipped around to see Henry standing only a few paces away, a sly grin on his face. "Look what we have here, hiding like little rabbits," he taunted, stepping closer. Heart racing, Eleanor's instincts kicked in. She realized the game had changed, but fear had to be replaced with action. "Get away from me," she declared, stepping back and searching for an escape route. "You shouldn't have run," Henry sneered, edging closer, his posture menacing. He thrived on their fear, relishing the power of the hunt. "You think you can just disappear?" Before she could react, a shout broke from behind him. "Henry, what are you doing?" Samuel's voice was stern as he approached, clearly confused by Henry's boldness. Seizing the distraction, Eleanor turned on her heel and bolted deeper into the underbrush. The adrenaline coursed through her as she raced forward, branches whipping against her skin, the sounds of pursuit igniting her resolve. "Stop her!" Samuel's shout echoed behind her, but Eleanor pushed harder, forcing herself to move through the darkness, navigating treacherous roots and fallen branches. She sprinted now, fierce determination in every stride, aware of the men gaining ground. Samuel's voice grew louder, urging Henry forward. Their impending presence fueled her desperation, propelling her to move faster. Eleanor felt the brush of wet leaves on her arms as she plunged through the dense foliage, trying to lose them in the maze of the forest. She had to find Margaret. They needed to unite and solidify their escape plan together. Moments later, she stumbled onto an open clearing bathed in moonlight. The glimmering surface of a small pond caught her eye. Without thinking, she veered toward it, hoping the water could provide a momentary hiding place. Crouching low, she slipped into the water's edge, the chilling cold wrapping around her like a cloak. The water didn't come up high but was enough to disguise her in the muddled depths. Henry and Samuel, faster than she anticipated, appeared at the edge of the clearing, their silhouettes cast against the luminescence of the moonlight. "Where did she go?" Henry demanded, scanning the area. "She has to be around here somewhere." Eleanor held her breath, willing her racing heart to slow, as she submerged herself slightly below the surface, only her eyes peeking out. She couldn't let the panic rise. She had to stay focused. "Split up and search the water," Samuel commanded. "She can't have gone far." As the men moved closer, Eleanor felt a rush of fear. They were methodical, each step calculated, searching every corner of the clearing and the pond's edges. "Eleanor, you can't hide forever," Samuel shouted, frustration rising. "Just come out, and we can talk this over." The words stung, amplified by their malicious undertones. Eleanor gritted her teeth, refusing to give in. They wouldn't take her or Margaret without a fight. She would survive. The thought of her sister pushed her to endure the biting cold. Time seemed to stretch as Samuel and Henry checked around, stirring the water's surface but not finding her. Their footsteps echoed off the nearby trees, which shielded Eleanor from view. Then, unexpectedly, the voices began to fade. "Let's check the other side of the brush line first. We'll regroup there," Samuel suggested. Eleanor watched as the shadows of the men retreated. As their voices turned into distant murmurs, she knew they would not stop searching. But she now had a brief window of opportunity. Taking a deep breath, she emerged from the water, shaking off the droplets that clung to her skin. She glanced around for signs of Margaret, the fear of being alone driving her forward with urgency. "Margaret!" Eleanor whispered, scanning the woods for any sign of her sister. "Margaret!" In the far distance, she heard a faint rustle. Then a voice whispered back, "Eleanor, over here!" Relief flooded through her as she followed the sound, quickening her pace. Soon she found Margaret crouched behind a cluster of bushes, wide eyes filled with concern. "I thought I lost you," Margaret gasped, tears forming as she wrapped her arms around Eleanor. "Not a chance," Eleanor replied, pulling her sister close. "We need to move again." "What's the plan?" Margaret asked quickly, her mind already scanning the surroundings. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to center herself. "We head east, toward the town. The men will expect us to stay near the river. If we can slip into town unnoticed, we might find a place to hide." Together they made their way through the underbrush, moving swiftly but cautiously to avoid detection. They ducked beneath branches and navigated through tangles of vines, adrenaline fueling their every step. As they reached the outskirts of the woods, the dim lights of the town twinkled on the horizon, a distant promise of safety that flickered and danced through the night. "Just a little more," Eleanor urged, her voice steady, leading them closer to the first signs of civilization. "We can make it." But as they approached the edge of town, a piercing scream cut through the silence, sending shivers down their spines. They froze, realization dawning like a swift, cold wind. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered, wide-eyed. "Keep moving," Eleanor instructed, her instincts flaring as she grasped Margaret's hand tightly. We can't let it stop us. They pressed on, hearts racing faster than their feet could carry them, knowing that they were on the brink of being trapped in a world that wanted to consume them. In the moon's soft glow, they moved toward the unknown, the promise of fresh starts mingling with the lurking shadows of their past. With their resolve stronger than ever, Eleanor and Margaret stepped into the light of town, determined to find safety, whatever it cost them. Whatever they faced, they would do it together. And this time, they would not be hunted. They would hunt back.